In approximately 1700 before the Common Era, beneath the blazing Cretan sun, a massive earthquake shattered the palace complex at Knossos, sending tremors through both Earth and Empire. The disaster would mark not merely geological upheaval, but the beginning of the end for Europe's first great civilization. The Minoans, whose legacy would be preserved not in their own records, but in the terrifying Greek myth of the Minotaur, a tale that may encode the dark final chapter of their dominance over the Aegean Sea. The Minoan civilization, centered on the island of Crete, had flourished for over half a millennium, building palatial centers adorned with vivid frescoes depicting bull-leaping ceremonies, elegant priestesses, and maritime prosperity. Their power radiated outward from Knossos, whose labyrinthine corridors would one day inspire legends of an inescapable maze. Unlike their mainland contemporaries, the Minoans constructed palaces without fortification walls, suggesting either supreme naval dominance or dangerous overconfidence. Archaeological evidence reveals sophisticated drainage systems, multi-story architecture, and vast storage facilities containing the economic lifeblood of their thalassocracy: grain, olive oil, wine, and luxury goods destined for distant shores. The Minoans ruled through what modern scholars term ritualized dominance. According to archaeologist Minotaurs, whose excavations at various Minoan sites have provided crucial insights, the bull-leaping ceremonies depicted so prominently in Minoan art may have represented more than mere sport or religious ritual. These dangerous performances possibly showcased the submission of mainland tribute-bearers, young men and women forced to participate in life-threatening displays for Cretan audiences. The youths who survived earned honor. Those who failed provided sacrifices to the earth-shaking god Poseidon, whom the Minoans worshipped as both protector and destroyer. From the Minoan perspective, their empire represented civilization itself. Their bureaucrats recorded transactions in Linear A, an undeciphered script that tantalizes scholars with its secrets. Their artisans created pottery so fine that it commanded premium prices throughout the Mediterranean. Their naval power ensured that coastal settlements from the Cycladic Islands to mainland Greece paid tribute in goods and significantly in human offerings. The palace at Knossos functioned as redistributive center, religious sanctuary, an administrative hub, a concentration of power that made it simultaneously magnificent and vulnerable. Yet from the perspective of subject peoples, particularly the emerging Mycenaean Greeks on the mainland, Minoan supremacy felt increasingly oppressive. These mainland communities, dwelling in fortress towns like Mycenae, Athens, and Tiryns, possessed their own warrior traditions and growing maritime ambitions. The tribute demanded by Knossos, including periodic selections of their youth for the bull courts, festered as a source of humiliation and rage. Greek oral traditions preserved memories of this subjugation through the myth of King Minos, whose very name likely derives from a Minoan title rather than a single ruler, demanding 7 young men and 7 young women every 9 years as tribute from Athens. The earthquake of approximately 1700 before the Common Era devastated much of Knossos, toppling columns and cracking walls in what seemed like divine punishment. The Minoans, demonstrating their civilization's resilience, rebuilt grander than before. But the disaster had revealed their vulnerability. The palace's reconstruction required resources, labor, and perhaps increased tribute from subject territories already strained by the economic disruptions caused by the catastrophe. The rebuilding efforts, while architecturally impressive, may have pushed the empire's exploitative systems to unsustainable levels. Unknown to the Minoan elite celebrating in their reconstructed throne room, forces beyond their control were converging. The volcanic island of Thera, 63 miles north of Crete, showed subtle signs of awakening. Mainland Greek communities, having witnessed Minoan vulnerability during the earthquake's aftermath, began secretly strengthening their own naval capabilities. And in the bull courts of Knossos, each new group of tribute-bearers arrived, carrying not just fear, but growing hatred or rage that would eventually find expression in myths of heroes, labyrinths, and the slaying of monsters. Between 1630 and 1600 before the Common Era, the island of Thera erupted with cataclysmic force, generating one of the largest volcanic explosions in human history. The blast, estimated at 6 times more powerful than the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, expelled approximately 39 cubic miles of magma, ash, and rock into the atmosphere. The immediate devastation struck Thera itself, burying the sophisticated settlement at Akrotiri under volcanic debris and transforming a thriving island into a crescent-shaped remnant surrounding a flooded caldera. The eruption's effects radiated across the Aegean world. Massive tsunamis, possibly reaching heights of over 100 feet, crashed into Crete's northern coast within minutes of the initial blast. The waves demolished harbor facilities, destroyed fishing fleets, and penetrated inland through river valleys, drowning fields and settlements. Knossos, situated several miles from the coast at a higher elevation, survived the tsunamis, but the palace complex sustained damage from earthquakes triggered by the volcanic collapse. More insidiously, ash fallout contaminated agricultural lands across eastern Crete, poisoning crops and pastures for seasons to come. From the Minoan administrative perspective, the disaster represented a crisis requiring immediate resource consolidation. Palace scribes documented losses in their undeciphered linear A tablets inventories that likely recorded destroyed ships, ruined warehouses, and depleted grain reserves. The bureaucratic response followed predictable patterns: increased tribute demands on surviving subject territories, rationing of stored resources, and intensified religious ceremonies to appease the gods. The priestess queens and priest kings of Knossos, whose authority derived partly from their perceived ability to mediate between human and divine realms, faced questions about why the gods had unleashed such devastation. The mainland Greek communities, while also affected by tsunamis and ash fallout, interpreted events differently. For the Mycenaeans, Athenians, and others who had long resented Minoan dominance, the catastrophe demonstrated that Knossos was not invincible. Greek oral traditions, preserved through centuries until finally recorded by classical authors, remembered this period as the time when King Aegeus of Athens made a desperate compact with Knossos. Following Athens' defeat in a conflict, possibly a rebellion attempt crushed by Minoan naval forces, the tribute terms became especially harsh. Every 9 years, 14 Athenian youths would sail to Crete to face the Minotaur. The mythological monster half-man, half-bull represented multiple dark realities compressed into symbolic form. The bull-leaping ceremonies, already dangerous, may have become deadlier as post-eruption resource scarcity made Minoan elites more callous toward foreign lives. The labyrinth from which none could escape likely referred to the actual palace at Knossos, whose sprawling corridors, multiple levels, and hundreds of rooms created a genuine maze that confused visitors. And the Minotaur himself perhaps embodied the faceless Minoan state system that consumed foreign youth in its ritualized violence. From the perspective of the tribute-bearers themselves, the journey to Crete meant sailing toward almost certain death. The selected youths came from Athens, noble family, a deliberate choice ensuring that the city's elite remained personally invested in maintaining peaceful relations with Knossos. Parents watched their children depart on ships with black sails, symbols of mourning, knowing they might never return. The young people themselves faced weeks of anticipation during the voyage, imagining the horrors awaiting them in the bull courts, where a single misstep meant disembowelment by the sacred animal's horns. Yet within this system of terror, resistance slowly gestated. The repeated tribute missions created unexpected connections between Athens and Crete. Some tribute-bearers survived and returned with knowledge of Minoan palace layouts, guard routines, and naval capabilities. Greek sailors learned Cretan sea routes and harbor vulnerabilities. Most significantly, the intensifying exploitation after the Thera eruption transformed what had been grudging acceptance of Minoan supremacy into active desire for liberation. The myth would remember this brewing rebellion through the figure of Theseus, a prince of Athens, who would volunteer as tribute with secret intentions of ending the sacrifices forever. Sometime in the late 17th or early 16th century, before the Common Era, a young man from the mainland, later mythologized as Theseus, son of King Aegeus, arrived at Knossos as part of the regular tribute shipment. Whether this figure was a historical prince, a composite of multiple rebel leaders, or purely legendary remains debated, but Greek tradition preserved vivid details suggesting some kernel of truth. Unlike previous tribute-bearers, who arrived in despair, this newcomer came with purpose. He intended not merely to survive the bull courts, but to dismantle the entire system of Minoan dominance. The archaeological record from this period reveals increasing signs of Mycenaean Greek presence within Minoan Crete. Pottery styles begin showing mainland influences. Linear B tablets, the Greek adaptation of Minoan linear astarte, appearing in palace contexts. Most tellingly, warrior graves with distinctly Mycenaean weapons and armor emerge in Cretan burial sites. These material traces suggest that the mythological narrative of Theseus may preserve memories of a more complex process. Not a single heroic assassination, but rather a gradual Mycenaean infiltration and eventual takeover of Minoan palace centers. According to the myth, Princess Ariadne, daughter of Minos, betrayed her own civilization by falling in love with Theseus and providing him with the tools for his mission. This romantic subplot likely encodes political reality. Minoan society, as evidenced by their artistic representations, afforded women significant religious and social authority. Priestesses held power, and palace frescoes depict women prominently in ceremonial contexts. It is entirely plausible that factions within the Minoan elite, observing their civilization's post-eruption decline, saw alliance with emerging Mycenaean powers as pragmatic rather than traitorous. Ariadne's thread that guided Theseus through the labyrinth may symbolize insider intelligence, palace maps, guard schedules, or passwords provided by collaborators within Knossos itself. The slaying of the Minotaur represents, in symbolic language, either the assassination of a Minoan ruler or the destruction of the bull cult's sacred authority. Significantly, the myth specifies that Theseus killed the creature with his bare hands or a club, not a sword, suggesting perhaps a ritualized confrontation that followed Minoan rather than Greek combat rules. The monster's death in the heart of the labyrinth parallels what likely occurred. A collapse of centralized authority within the palace complex itself, possibly during one of the religious festivals, when the palace population swelled and security measures were compromised by ceremonial priorities. From the Minoan perspective, this period represented catastrophic betrayal and incomprehensible collapse. Their palace systems, which had functioned for centuries, suddenly fragmented. The tributary networks that had sustained their redistributive economy ceased flowing. Archaeological evidence shows that around this time, Knossos and other major palace sites experienced destruction. Events, whether from internal rebellion, external invasion, or some combination, remains contested. What is certain is that Minoan civilization never recovered its former dominance. The mainland Greek perspective transformed these events into founding mythology. Theseus became Athens' greatest hero, the king unifier who established democratic principles and freed his people from foreign oppression. The black-sailed ships that had carried tribute bearers to their deaths supposedly returned with white sails, signaling victory, though in the myth's tragic twist, Theseus forgot to change the sails, causing his father Aegeus to commit suicide by throwing himself into the sea that thereafter bore his name. This detail may preserve memory of the political costs of rebellion. Even in victory, the older generation of leaders who had accommodated Minoan power did not survive the transition. The immediate aftermath saw Mycenaean Greeks assuming control of Cretan palace sites. Linear B tablets from Knossos dating to the 15th century before the Common Era are clearly written in an early form of Greek, demonstrating that Greek-speaking administrators now managed what had been the heart of Minoan civilization. The conquered had become conquerors, the tribute-bearers had become rulers, and the labyrinth had been transformed from a prison into a Greek administrative center. The Mycenaean occupation of Knossos, beginning sometime in the 15th century before the Common Era, transformed the palace from a Minoan religious and administrative center into something fundamentally different, a militarized outpost of mainland Greek power. The new rulers preserved some Minoan architectural features and adopted aspects of their sophisticated bureaucracy, but the character of the site changed profoundly. Fortification walls, largely absent from Minoan construction, now appeared at various Cretan settlements. The flowing, naturalistic Minoan artistic style gradually gave way to the more rigid geometric patterns favored by Mycenaean craftsmen. Most significantly, the linear B tablets reveal an economy organized around warrior elites and chariot warfare rather than maritime trade and religious ritual. Yet the inheritance was cursed, as Greek mythology itself would acknowledge. Theseus, having liberated Athens from Minoan tribute, abandoned Ariadne on the island of Naxos during the return voyage betrayal that earned divine punishment. His father's suicide upon seeing the black sails created a blood guilt that haunted his reign. These mythological consequences may reflect historical guilt about the systematic destruction of Minoan civilization. The Greeks, having suffered under Minoan dominance, responded by not merely defeating their oppressors, but by attempting to eradicate their culture entirely, occupying their sacred spaces and appropriating their religious symbols, while suppressing their language and traditions. From the surviving Minoan population's perspective, the period following the Greek conquest represented cultural catastrophe. Their language, linear A, ceased being used for administrative purposes and eventually disappeared entirely, remaining undeciphered to this day. Their religious practices were either suppressed or absorbed into Greek cult systems, losing their original meanings. The bull, once sacred in Minoan ritual, became in Greek mythology a monster to be slain. The priestess queens, who had wielded authority in Minoan society, found no equivalent position in the patriarchal Mycenaean system. Archaeological evidence suggests population dispersal from palace centers to mountainous refuge areas, where small communities preserved what they could of their heritage even as the larger civilization collapsed. The cursed nature of the inheritance extended beyond cultural destruction. Knossos, under Greek administration, never regained its former prosperity. The palace burned in a massive conflagration around 1400 before the Common Era. Whether from accident, rebellion, or external attack remains debated. Unlike previous destructions, this time the palace was not rebuilt to its former grandeur. The elaborate complex became a ruin, its corridors exposed to the elements, its frescoes fading, its storage magazines emptying. Meanwhile, on the mainland, the Mycenaean civilization that had conquered Crete entered its own troubled period. According to the work of archaeologist Cynthia Shelmerdine, whose research on Mycenaean administration has illuminated this period's complex economic systems, the palace economies of mainland Greece became increasingly strained by the 13th century before the Common Era. Warfare between Greek states intensified. The famous expedition to Troy, later immortalized in Homer's epics, may have been a desperate attempt to seize resources as internal systems failed. The conquerors of Crete were themselves about to experience catastrophic collapse. The myth cycle itself acknowledges this cursed legacy. Theseus, having killed the Minotaur and claimed Ariadne, ultimately lost everything: his lover, his father, and eventually his throne. His descendants faced continuous tragedy. The Greek heroes who conquered Crete did not live happily ever after. Instead, they inaugurated a period of warfare, betrayal, and eventual systemic collapse. It is as if the destruction of Minoan civilization released a curse that infected the victors, ensuring that they too would experience the horror of watching their world crumble. By the 12th century, before the Common Era, both Minoan Crete and Mycenaean Greece had collapsed into the chaos, remembered as the Late Bronze Age collapsa. Period when literacy disappeared, palace centers were abandoned, trade networks disintegrated, and population levels plummeted across the eastern Mediterranean. The labyrinth at Knossos lay empty, its passages walked only by wind, its purpose forgotten, waiting for archaeologists millennia later to excavate the ruins and confront the dark truths encoded in the Minotaur myth. When Sir Arthur Evans began excavating Knossos in 1900, he approached the site with Victorian certainties about civilization and barbarism that would profoundly shape and distort interpretation of what he uncovered. Evans, working decades before modern archaeological methodology emphasized objective documentation, reconstructed large sections of the palace using reinforced concrete and vibrant paint schemes based on his imaginative interpretations rather than strict evidence. His restorations, while creating a visually impressive sight that attracts hundreds of thousands of tourists annually, have made it difficult for subsequent scholars to distinguish genuine Minoan architecture from early 20th century fantasy. Evans named the civilization Minoan, after the mythological king Minos, immediately framing the archaeological evidence within the Greek narrative, rather than allowing the material remains to speak for themselves. He interpreted the palace as a peaceful, sophisticated center of a prosperous thalassocracy ruled by priest-kings engaged in benign religious ritual. The bull-leaping frescoes, he argued, depicted voluntary sport rather than anything coercive. The vast storage facilities demonstrated peaceful trade rather than tribute extraction. The absence of fortification walls proved to Evans that the Minoans ruled through cultural superiority rather than military force. Modern archaeological reassessment, however, has revealed darker dimensions that Evans either missed or deliberately minimized. Excavations at various Minoan sites have uncovered evidence that directly challenges the peaceful narrative. At Knossos itself, a building known as the North House contained human bones bearing cut marks, consistent with ritual sacrifice or cannibalism. Discovered during the 1979 excavation season, at Animaspelia, archaeologists found an apparent human sacrifice in progress when an earthquake struck around 1700 before the Common Era young man bound on an altar with a bronze blade beside him. These discoveries suggest that Minoan religion included practices that their subject peoples might reasonably have considered monstrous. The Minotaur myth, viewed through this archaeological evidence, transforms from pure fantasy into encoded historical memory. The tribute of Athenian youths may preserve actual memories of forced labor or sacrificial victims sent to Crete. The labyrinth from which none could escape accurately describes both the physical reality of Knossos' confusing corridors and the political reality of Minoan naval dominance that made rebellion nearly impossible. The monster itself, half-human, half-bull, symbolizes a civilization that combines sophisticated culture with brutality, refinement with ritualized violence. From our contemporary perspective, Minoan case illustrates how civilizations construct narratives that justify their power while obscuring their violence. The Minoans likely told themselves stories about their cultural superiority and religious necessity that made the exploitation of subject peoples seem natural and right. The Mycenaean Greeks, after conquering Crete, told different stories, ones that cast themselves as liberators, destroying a monster rather than acknowledging their own imperialism and cultural destruction. Evans, excavating millennia later, told yet another story that reflected Victorian assumptions about peaceful, feminine Crete versus militaristic, masculine Greece. What, then, can the Minotaur myth ultimately reveal about the Minoans? It preserves in symbolic form the perspective of the oppressed, the tribute-bearers, who experienced Minoan civilization, not as sophisticated culture, but as a system of exploitation enforced through ritual violence. It encodes memory of how that system ended, through internal weakness following natural disaster. Insider betrayal by members of the elite who saw collaboration with rising powers as preferable to defending a failing civilization, and violent rebellion by subject peoples who had endured generations of submission. The myth also reveals an uncomfortable truth about historical memory. We remember the oppressors. Civilization with fascination and even admiration, attracted by their artistic achievements and architectural sophistication. While the suffering of their victims survives only in fragmentary form, encoded in stories about monsters, the Minoans created beautiful frescoes, sophisticated plumbing, and intricate architecture, but they also created the conditions that their subjects remembered as the Minotaur. Both truths coexist, neither canceling the other, challenging us to hold complexity rather than choosing comfortable simplification. The labyrinth, it seems, was never just a building or a myth. It was, and remains, the ethical maze of understanding civilizations that were simultaneously cultured and cruel, sophisticated and savage, human and monstrous.